Could you survive a single day in the world of the Nephilim? Not a week, not an hour, a day. The answer, and you must know this before we begin, is no. Not biologically, not perceptually, not spiritually. Your lungs would labour against air too thick to process. Your heart would strain under pressures your circulatory system was never designed to bear. And your eyes would fail to translate the light that filtered through a sky fundamentally different from the one you know. The world of the Nephilim was not built for you. You're a creature of aftermath, of diminishment, of a reality that emerged only after theirs was drowned. Imagine, if you will, a threshold, a doorway that exists nowhere and everywhere, carved into the fabric of memory itself. On this side, the world you know, with its familiar weight, its predictable rhythms, its comfortable scale. On the other side, something older, something vaster, something that your body recognizes at a cellular level as fundamentally incompatible with your continued existence. The air beyond that threshold is not merely denser, it is charged with a quality that modern lungs cannot name, thick as water but breathable, if you were built for it. The gravity pulls differently, or perhaps it is that mass itself behaves according to laws that no longer apply, that were suspended or altered when the world was reset. The light comes through at angles and wavelengths that would burn your retinas or reveal colours. Your visual cortex has no categories to process, because the sky itself was structured differently, filtered through a canopy or firmament that collapsed millennia ago. Step through that threshold and you would not conquer, you would not explore, you would not survive, you would suffocate, or your heart would give out, or your mind would fracture under the weight of perceiving what should not be perceived. This is not hyperbole. This is not metaphor. This is the biological reality of a world calibrated for beings of different density, different scale, different origin. But here is the tension that will haunt us throughout this journey. The world of the Nephilim did not end because it was conquered by a superior force. It did not collapse under its own weight or fade into obscurity through the natural entropy of civilizations. It ended because it could not be allowed to continue, because what was happening there, the mingling of celestial and terrestrial, the proliferation of knowledge that unmade boundaries, the emergence of beings whose very existence was a violation of divine architecture, represented a threat so profound that the only response was erasure. Total, catastrophic, world-drowning erasure. The Nephilim are not merely myths whispered around campfires or scribbled in the margins of ancient texts by scribes who misunderstood what they were recording. They are memories encoded in stone too massive to be fully destroyed, in DNA that carries fragments we are only now beginning to decode in the architecture of civilizations that should not exist according to the timelines we have constructed. They are the reason Baalbek's foundation stones weigh 800 tons, and were placed with a precision that modern engineering struggles to replicate. They are the reason Göbekli Tepe sits buried in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, built by hands that understood geometry and astronomy, before the supposed invention of agriculture. They are the reason elongated skulls with cranial volumes exceeding modern human capacity have been found in Peru, in Egypt, in Malta. Skulls that do not fit comfortably into our taxonomies, that whisper of lineages we have not accounted for. They are the reason every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and millennia, tells variations of the same story, that there were giants once, that they taught humanity arts both wondrous and terrible, that they were destroyed in a flood that reshaped the world, that we are what came after. You wouldn't last a day in the Nephilim's world. But the question that will echo through every section of this exploration, the question that will not release you even as you drift towards sleep, is this: why do we remember them at all? If they were truly erased, if the flood accomplished its purpose and reset the world to eliminate every trace of what had been, why do the stones still speak? Why do the myths align across continents and cultures that had no contact? Why does the memory persist in our collective unconscious, surfacing in dreams and symbols, and the restless human drive to build towers, to reach toward the heavens, to transgress the boundaries between earth and sky? Why do we feel, at the edges of perception, the presence of something larger, older, more terrible, and more magnificent than the diminished world we inherited? This is the journey we are about to undertake together. We will walk through the physical reality of the Nephilim's world, the atmosphere that would kill you, the flora and fauna of an Earth optimized for gigantism, the temporal rhythms that moved at a different cadence. We will examine the beings themselves, the watchers who descended, the daughters of men they took as wives, and the hybrid offspring whose strength could move mountains and whose appetites consumed the earth. We will trace the evidence they left behind, the monuments that defy explanation, the genetic anomalies that suggest interbreeding with populations we have no name for, the underground structures and underwater ruins that hint at a global civilization dispersed by cataclysm. We will explore the flood itself, not as divine punishment but as divine mercy, a reset necessitated by a world that had become unsustainable, where the boundary between heaven and earth had been breached beyond repair. We will ask why humanity shrank after the deluge, why lifespans collapsed from centuries to decades, why the knowledge of the pre-flood world fragmented into mystery, schools and secret societies rather than surviving intact, and we will confront the possibility, the haunting, unsettling possibility, that the story is not finished, that the erasure was not complete, that we carry something of the Nephilim forward in our genes, our symbols, our relentless drive to reclaim what was lost. That history is not linear but cyclical, spiralling back toward the same threshold, the same choice, the same forbidden union of earth and heaven. This is not a world that forgot you. You are a world that forgot this. But the forgetting is incomplete. The memory persists in the stones, in the myths, in the strange pull you feel when you stand before a monument that should not exist and ask yourself, who built this? How? And why does it feel like a message meant for me? You wouldn't last a day in the Nephilim's world, but the Nephilim's world, in fragments, in echoes, in the hidden architecture of reality, lasts in you. Let us begin. Imagine your first breath in the world of the Nephilim, not the easy, thoughtless inhalation you take now as you settle into sleep, but a breath that resists you, that pushes back against your lungs with the weight of water pressing down from the surface when you dive too deep. The air would be thick, substantive, almost liquid in its density, each molecule packed so tightly against the next that your chest would have to work twice as hard to draw it in, and even then your body would not know what to do with it. The oxygen content would be higher than anything your blood has been calibrated to process, flooding your cells with a richness that would feel like drowning in atmosphere, like breathing pure light. Your heart, evolved for the thin, depleted air of a post-flood world, would race and stumble, unable to regulate the pressure that would build in your arteries, in the chambers of your lungs, in the delicate vessels behind your eyes. You would feel it immediately, not as pain, not at first, but as wrongness, as a fundamental incompatibility between your body and the world pressing in on all sides. The barometric pressure alone would be catastrophic for you, a modern human stepping through an invisible threshold into a realm where the weight of the sky is not an abstraction, but a physical force bearing down on every inch of your skin. Some scientists who have studied the fossil record, who have measured the wingspans of ancient dragonflies, the size of hawks, and the bone density of creatures that should have collapsed under their own mass, have speculated that the pre-flood atmosphere must have been fundamentally different, not merely in composition, but in structure, in the way it held itself above the earth. They speak of a vapor canopy, a firmament of suspended water that encased the planet like a second skin, filtering the light from the sun and creating a greenhouse effect that would have made the entire world a garden, lush and humid and perpetually warm. Under such conditions, the atmospheric pressure at ground level would have been significantly higher, perhaps 1.5 times what you experience now, perhaps double, and your body, your fragile, diminished body, would buckle under the strain. Consider what this would mean for your cellular metabolism, for the intricate dance of oxygen and carbon dioxide that keeps you alive without your conscious participation. Your mitochondria, those ancient engines inherited from bacteria that merged with your ancestors billions of years ago, are tuned to extract energy from the lean fuel of modern air. Flood them with the hyper-oxygenated atmosphere of the Nephilim's world, and they would run too hot, producing free radicals at a rate your antioxidant systems could not manage, aging you at an accelerated pace even as the environment around you sustained beings who lived for centuries. The paradox is cruel. The very conditions that allowed Methuselah to see 969 years would burn through your lifespan in months, perhaps weeks, as your cells oxidized and degraded under the relentless pressure of an atmosphere you were never meant to breathe. And the light, oh, the light would be unlike anything you have ever witnessed, even in your most vivid dreams. Refracted through the vapor canopy, the sun's rays would arrive at the surface diffused and softened, stripped of the harsh ultraviolet that now ages your skin and mutates your DNA, but enriched with wavelengths your eyes cannot currently perceive. The world would shimmer with colours that have no names in your language, hues that exist in the infrared and ultraviolet spectrums, visible to beings whose eyes were built on a different blueprint than yours. Some ancient texts describe the pre-flood world as a place of perpetual twilight, where the sun was a soft glow diffused across the entire dome of the sky, rather than a single point of burning intensity, and where rainbows were unknown because rain never fell. The earth was watered by mists that rose from the ground, by dew that condensed from the saturated air. You would squint and strain, your retinas overwhelmed by wavelengths they have no receptors to process, your brain struggling to interpret signals that do not fit the narrow band of visible light evolution has prepared you for. You would be, in essence, partially blind in a world of impossible colour. Gravity itself might have felt different, not because the fundamental constant had changed, but because your relationship to it would be mediated by an atmosphere so dense it would provide buoyancy, a cushioning effect that would allow creatures of immense mass to move with a grace that defies the square-cube law. Picture the trees, not the modest specimens you know, but titans that pierced the cloud layer, their trunks wider than houses, their roots spreading across acres like the veins of the earth itself. Fossil evidence suggests that before the flood, plant life grew to proportions that would be mechanically impossible in the current atmosphere. Redwoods and sequoias are but echoes of a lost standard, diminished descendants clinging to the memory of when the air was thick enough to support wood that reached toward the stars. The insects, too, would have been monstrous by your reckoning. Dragonflies with wingspans measured in feet, millipedes as long as your body, beetles armoured in chitin thick as your fingernail. They thrived in an oxygen-rich world where the limitations of tracheal breathing systems no longer applied, where the very air pumped life into forms that would suffocate in the lean atmosphere you call home. The reptiles, those ancient architects of scale, would have dwarfed even the largest dinosaurs you know from paleontological reconstructions. Sauropods that stretched 100 feet from nose to tail, predators whose jaws could crush stone, marine reptiles that moved through the oceans like living ships. The fossil record is fragmentary, sanitized by time and the violence of the flood, but the pieces that remain suggest a world where gigantism was not the exception but the rule, where every niche was filled by life that had scaled upward, reaching towards some upper limit imposed not by physics, but by the catastrophe that would eventually reset the clock. You, standing among these beings, would be less than an insect, less than a thought, a fragile mammal whose ancestors had not yet crawled from the shadows, whose entire lineage was waiting in the wings for the age of giants to end. Time itself would move differently in the Nephilim's world, or rather, your perception of time would unravel in an environment not governed by the celestial mechanics you take for granted. The Genesis patriarchs lived for centuries, Adam for 930 years, Seth for 912, Enoch for 365 before he walked with God and was not, and the Sumerian king lists speak of reigns that spanned tens of thousands of years before the flood, a chronology so absurd by modern standards that scholars have spent centuries trying to rationalize it as myth, as metaphor, as corrupted data transmitted across millennia. But what if the numbers are literal? What if the pre-flood world operated on a temporal cadence so different from ours that a year was not a year, a day was not a day, and the aging process itself was slowed by the same atmospheric and environmental conditions that allowed trees to grow for millennia and reptiles to reach the size of buildings? Your circadian rhythms, that internal clock synchronized to the rotation of the earth and the cycle of light and dark, would shatter in a world where days might have been longer, where the diffused light from the vapor canopy created a perpetual softness that blurred the boundary between dawn and dusk, where seasons, if they existed at all, would have been gradual, almost imperceptible shifts in temperature and humidity rather than the stark transitions you navigate now. You would feel it in your bones, in the leaden weight of your eyelids at the wrong times, in the gnawing hunger that would come too soon, or not soon enough. in the disorientation of a body trying to find its rhythm in a world that has no rhythm you can follow. Sleep would become elusive, fragmented, haunted by the sense that you are out of phase with reality itself, that every system in your body is crying out for a cycle that no longer exists. The analogy writes itself. You would be like a deep-sea creature suddenly thrust onto land. Every adaptation that allows you to survive in the crushing darkness of the abyss rendered useless, even lethal, in the thin air and harsh light of the surface. Your body is a product of the post-flood world, shaped by 10,000 years of evolution in an environment of scarcity, harshness, and diminishment. You are built for a world where the air is thin, where ultraviolet light mutates your DNA and forces your cells to die and regenerate quickly, where food is scarce and survival depends on efficiency rather than scale. The Nephilim's world was the opposite, a realm of abundance, of density, of life that grew large and lived long because the environment rewarded size and punished nothing. To step into that world would be to step into a pressure chamber designed for beings of a different order, and your body would fail not because it is weak, but because it is wrong, calibrated for a reality that no longer exists. This is not a world that forgot you. You are a world that forgot this. The phrase will echo through the hours ahead, a refrain that returns each time we confront another impossibility, another threshold you cannot cross. The Nephilim's world did not fade from memory because it was unimportant. It faded because the flood erased the conditions that made it possible. Because the survivors, human and otherwise, were thrust into a new reality where the old rules no longer applied, where the giants could not breathe, could not stand, could not endure, and we, their distant descendants, carry only the faintest genetic and mythic traces of what once was, like a photograph left too long in the sun, the details bleached away but the outline still visible if you know where to look. Consider the implications. If the atmosphere was denser, if the pressure was higher, if the oxygen content was richer, then every creature that lived in that world, including the Nephilim themselves, would have been adapted to those conditions in ways we can barely imagine. Their lungs would have been larger, more efficient, capable of extracting oxygen from air that would poison you. Their hearts would have been stronger, their blood vessels thicker, their cellular machinery optimized for an environment of abundance rather than scarcity. They would have moved through the thick air with ease, their massive frames supported by an atmosphere that provided buoyancy, their senses attuned to wavelengths of light and frequencies of sound that are invisible and inaudible to you. And when the flood came, when the vapor canopy collapsed and the fountains of the deep broke open, and the world was remade in violence and water, those adaptations became liabilities. The giants suffocated in the new air, their bodies too large to be sustained by the thin atmosphere that remained, their lifespans collapsing from centuries to decades, as the environmental conditions that had allowed for extended longevity vanished in a single cataclysm. You would not last a day in their world, but they could not last a day in yours, and that is the mercy and the tragedy of the flood, the reset that severed the link between heaven and earth, that shrunk the scale of life down to something manageable, something that could endure in a world of scarcity and struggle. The Nephilim's world was not sustainable. It was a hothouse, a garden that had grown too wild, and the flood was the pruning, the cutting back, the return to a baseline from which life could begin again, in a form that would not reach too far, that would not transgress the boundaries set between the terrestrial and the celestial. But the memory lingers, encoded in the megaliths they left behind, in the myths that speak of giants and watchers, in the fossil record that shows creatures of impossible size, in the genetic anomalies that suggest our ancestors interbred with something other, something that has no name in the taxonomies of modern science. The world that would kill you is gone, drowned beneath miles of sediment and the weight of 10,000 years, but its traces remain, and as you drift towards sleep, as your breath slows and your mind begins to wander through the landscapes of dream, you might catch a glimpse of it. The dense air, the refracted light, the trees that touch the sky, the beings who walked between worlds. You would not survive the encounter, but perhaps, in the liminal space between waking and sleep, you can visit, you can stand at the threshold and peer through, you can feel the weight of the air pressing against your skin and know, for just a moment, what it was like when the earth was young and the heavens were close, and the giants walked in the garden before the rain began to fall. This is not a world that forgot you. You are a world that forgot this, and forgetting, as we will see, was never quite complete. Part 2. The Nephilim and the Watchers. Beings between heaven and earth. Who were the Nephilim? The question itself is a threshold, and to cross it is to enter a labyrinth of texts that contradict, overlap, and whisper truths too strange for history to contain. Genesis 6 gives us only fragments. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. 14 words in the King James translation, and within them a Aost, cosmology that fractures the boundary between heaven and earth, between the possible and the forbidden. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most biblical canons yet preserved by Ethiopian Christianity, quoted in the New Testament and revered by early church fathers, expands the narrative into something vast and terrible. 200 watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, descend to Mount Hermon and take an oath, a covenant of transgression. They desire the daughters of men, not merely in lust, but in a hunger to merge their celestial essence with terrestrial flesh, to create something that should not exist. The leader, Azazel, teaches men to forge swords and shields. Semjaza instructs them in enchantments. Armoros reveals the breaking of spells. Barakijal teaches astrology. Kokabel the constellations. Ezekiel the knowledge of clouds. Arakiel the signs of the earth. Shamsiel the signs of the sun. Sariel the course of the moon. These are not gifts. They are violations, knowledge torn from the heavens and planted in soil that cannot sustain it. The offspring of this union, the Nephilim, are described with a horror that transcends metaphor. The Book of Enoch speaks of giants 300 cubits tall, a measure that translates to roughly 450 feet, beings whose heads would brush the clouds, whose footsteps would shake the foundations of mountains. Even if we allow for hyperbole, for the inflation of memory through generations of oral transmission, the core remains. These were not merely large humans. They were beings of a different order, hybrids whose biology defied the constraints that govern flesh. The Book of Jubilees, another apocryphal text preserved in Ethiopic and fragments of Hebrew and Latin, corroborates and deepens the account. It describes the Watchers as beings who began to commit sin with the daughters of men and their children as creatures whose appetites knew no limit. They consumed all the labour of men, and when that was insufficient they turned upon humanity itself, devouring flesh, drinking blood, and filling the earth with violence. This is not the violence of war or conquest, it is the violence of predation, of beings whose metabolic needs exceeded what the world could provide. Sumerian cosmology offers its own echoes. The Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens to work the earth, bear structural similarities to the Watchers. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Enkidu as a wild man created by the gods, a being of immense strength who must be civilized through union with a mortal woman, a reversal of the Watcher narrative but with the same mingling of divine and terrestrial. The Sumerian king list records reigns of impossible length before the flood. Alulim ruled for 2800 years, Alaljar for 36,000 years. These are not metaphors. They are records of a time when the measure of existence operated under different laws. Greek mythology preserves the memory in the Titans, primordial, beings of colossal stature who warred against the Olympian gods and were cast into Tartarus, a prison beneath the earth. The Gigantomachy, the war of the giants, mirrors the divine intervention against the Nephilim. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, parallels the Watchers who taught forbidden arts. The Greeks understood what Genesis only hints at. Knowledge has weight, and some knowledge crushes those who receive it. Indigenous cosmologies across the world carry fragments of the same story. The Quinametsin of Mesoamerican tradition were giants who inhabited the earth before the current age, builders of the Great Pyramids, beings who were destroyed in a cataclysm. The Paiute of North America speak of the Sita-Ka, red-haired giants who lived in caves and were annihilated by a coalition of tribes. The Maori of New Zealand remember a race of tall beings who preceded them, whose bones are said to rest in hidden caves. The memory is global, dispersed across cultures with no contact, encoded in languages that share no common root, and yet the pattern persists. The physical descriptions of the Nephilim suggest a biology that our physiology cannot accommodate. 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, polydactyly, a genetic trait that appears sporadically in human populations, but which ancient texts describe as a marker of the giants. 2 Samuel 21:20 and 1 Chronicles 26 both record a giant of Gath, a descendant of the Rephaim, that had on every hand 6 fingers and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he also was born to the giant. This is not symbolic, it is anatomical. Elongated skulls, cranial deformation found in sites across Peru, Bolivia, Egypt and Malta present another anomaly. The Paracas skulls of southern Peru exhibit cranial volumes up to 25% larger than modern humans, with structural differences that some researchers argue cannot be explained by artificial binding alone. The sagittal suture, the fibrous joint that runs along the top of the skull, is absent in some specimens, replaced by a single unified bone. The foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord passes, is positioned differently, suggesting a different angle of the head relative to the spine. These are not deformations, they are variations, and the question of whether they represent a distinct lineage or merely the extreme edge of human morphology remains unresolved. Strength that could move mountains, hyperbole surely, and yet the megalithic structures we will explore later suggest that someone, something, possessed the capacity to manipulate stones weighing hundreds of tons with a precision that modern engineering struggles to replicate. The biblical account of Og, king of Bashan, describes his bed as 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. A bed built for a body of proportions that defy the square cube. Law, the principle that dictates as an organism increases in size, its volume grows faster than its surface area, making gigantism biologically unsustainable without radical adaptations in skeletal structure, musculature, and cardiovascular systems. The skills the Watchers taught, metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, warfare, enchantments, root cutting, were not neutral. The Book of Enoch frames them as corruptions, arts that elevated humanity beyond its ordained station and introduced knowledge that fractured the simplicity of Eden. Metallurgy gave rise to weapons, and with weapons, organized violence. Astronomy revealed the movements of the heavens, and with that knowledge came the temptation to manipulate fate, to read the stars not as divine signs but as tools of prediction and control. Cosmetics, seemingly trivial, are described as instruments of seduction and deception, the alteration of appearance to provoke desire and conceal truth. Root cutting, herbalism, and the knowledge of plants open the door to medicine but also to poisons, to abortifacients, to substances that alter consciousness and perception. Enchantments. The word itself carries the weight of the forbidden. In the original Aramaic and Hebrew, the term encompasses not only spoken spells, but the manipulation of sound, resonance, and vibration to affect matter. Some esoteric traditions suggest the Watchers taught a form of sonic technology, a science of frequency that could levitate stones, shatter mountains, or alter the molecular structure of materials. This is not fantasy. Modern physics understands that sound is pressure, that pressure can move mass, and that certain frequencies can induce resonance in solid objects. The question is not whether sound can move matter, it can, but whether the ancients possessed a mastery of this principle that we have lost. The moral and cosmic stakes of the Nephilim's existence transcend their physical form. They were a disruption of divine order, beings whose very existence violated the separation between heaven and earth, between the eternal and the temporal. Genesis describes the earth as corrupt and filled with violence because of them, language that suggests not merely moral failure, but ontological contamination, a world in which the categories of creation had blurred beyond recognition. The Nephilim's appetites for food, for knowledge, for power, consumed the earth, and their violence was not the violence of conflict, but of entropy, a force that unravelled the fabric of the world itself. They were not destroyed because they were evil. They were destroyed because they were possible. This refrain, which will echo through the remainder of our exploration, captures the existential dread at the heart of the Nephilim narrative. Evil can be redeemed, corrected, transformed. But the Nephilim represented a category error, a form of existence that could not be allowed to continue because its continuation would have meant the end of the world as a coherent, ordered creation. The flood was not punishment. It was surgery. the excision of a growth that threatened to consume the host. The archaeological anomalies tied to their memory are fragmentary, contested, and haunting. The Paracas skulls already mentioned remain unexplained by mainstream anthropology, which attributes them to cranial binding, a practice documented across cultures, but which cannot fully account for the structural differences or the increased cranial volume. 6-fingered handprints appear in ancient caves and petroglyphs, notably in the American Southwest, where ancestral Puebloan sites preserve images of hands with 6 digits pressed into stone. Are these symbolic representations of the divine or the other, or are they literal, impressions left by individuals who carried a genetic trait linked to an older, larger lineage? The legends of Og and Goliath are not isolated. Deuteronomy 3:11 describes Og's bed, already noted, and frames him as the remnant of the Rephaim, a race of giants that once inhabited the land. Goliath of Gath, whose height is given as 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet 9 inches, is described in 1 Samuel 17 not as an anomaly, but as one of the sons of the giant, suggesting a lineage, a population, not merely an individual mutation. The Anakim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, these are tribal names, not metaphors, and the biblical texts describe their extermination in language that suggests a divine mandate to complete the work the flood began. The genetic mystery deepens the enigma. In recent years, studies of ancient DNA have revealed ghost populations, lineages that interbred with Homo sapiens, but which do not correspond to any known hominid species. Denisovans, identified from a single finger bone found in a Siberian cave, contributed genetic material to modern Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and some Asian populations. Neanderthals interbred with early humans, leaving traces in the genomes of non-African populations. But there are other signals, statistical anomalies in the genetic data that suggest additional unidentified lineages, populations that existed, interbred, and vanished, leaving only fragments of their code in our cells. Could the Nephilim have been one such lineage? A population of large-statured, possibly hybrid beings whose biology was distinct enough to leave a genetic signature, but whose existence was so brief, so catastrophically terminated, that their physical remains are rare or misidentified. The idea is speculative, but it is not absurd. We have found the bones of hominids that lived alongside Homo sapiens. Why not the bones of beings who were neither fully human nor fully other, whose existence was erased not by time but by intention? The philosophical question this raises is profound and unsettling. If the Nephilim were real, not as metaphor, not as myth, but as biological entities whose existence is encoded in texts, in stone, and possibly in our own DNA, what does that make us? Are we the inheritors of their knowledge, the beneficiaries of the arts they taught, the civilization they seeded? Or are we the survivors of their erasure, a diminished humanity shaped by the trauma of the flood, living in a world deliberately reduced to make us small, to keep us safe from the heights our ancestors reached and the depths into which they fell? Are we the descendants of those who touched the stars, or are we the descendants of those who were spared because they never tried? The Nephilim were not merely large. They were a threshold, a proof of concept that the boundary between heaven and earth could be crossed, that the divine and the mortal could merge, that knowledge could be stolen and flesh could be altered. Their destruction was not a moral judgment, but a cosmic necessity. The closing of a door that, once opened, threatened to consume everything. They were not destroyed because they were evil. They were destroyed because they were possible, and if they were possible once, the question that lingers as we drift deeper into this exploration is whether they could be possible again, whether the conditions that allowed their existence, whatever those conditions were, could return. Whether we, in our drive to decode the genome, to extend life, to transcend the limits of flesh, and reach beyond the earth, are walking the same path, approaching the same threshold, drawn by the same hunger that once brought angels down from heaven and gave birth to beings who could not be allowed to live. You wouldn't last a day in their world, but their world, it seems, may yet last in the architecture of your cells, in the symbols you build, in the knowledge you seek, and in the restless sense that you are smaller than you should be, that something was taken, that you are living in the aftermath of a war you do not remember but whose scars you carry. The Nephilim are gone, but the door they opened has never fully closed, and memory, encoded in stone and blood and the myths we cannot stop telling, suggests that what was erased was not forgotten, only buried, waiting for the conditions to shift, for the waters to recede, for the threshold to be crossed once more. Part 3. The traces they left, monuments, ruins, and the memory encoded in stone. Stand before the Trilithon at Baalbek, and you will understand that something is wrong with history. 3 blocks of limestone, each weighing approximately 800 tons, rest upon a foundation wall as if placed there by hands that found such mass trivial, inconsequential, a matter of simple arrangement rather than engineering miracle. 800 tons, not the weight of a building, but the weight of a naval destroyer, and yet these stones were quarried from a hillside nearly a mile away, transported across uneven terrain, lifted 20 feet into the air, and set with such precision that a knife blade cannot slip between their joints. Modern cranes struggle to lift a quarter of that weight. The largest mobile crane in the world today maxes out at roughly 1,200 tons and requires stabilization systems, computer guidance, and teams of engineers to move a fraction of the distance. And yet there they sit, the Trilithon stones, silent and massive and utterly indifferent to the impossibility of their own existence, as if daring you to explain them away with theories of ramps and levers, and the patience of thousands of workers who somehow moved mass that defies the very mathematics we use to build our cities. Travel to Pumapunku in the highlands of Bolivia, and the paradox deepens into something approaching the uncanny. Here, blocks of andesite, a volcanic stone harder than granite, resistant to the best steel tools we possess, have been cut with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, their surfaces polished to a reflective sheen, their corners meeting at perfect right angles, their interlocking joints so precise that they suggest not the work of chisels and hammers, but of machinery, of laser guidance, of technologies that should not exist in a culture we're told had no written language, no wheel, no beasts of burden capable of moving stones that weigh tens of tons. The H-blocks of Pumapunku, with their complex grooves and channels, their uniform dimensions repeated across dozens of stones, speak to a manufacturing process, a standardization, a knowledge of geometry and engineering that feels alien when set against the timeline we have been given. A timeline that places these structures in an era when humanity was supposedly just learning to plant seeds and domesticate animals, not cutting volcanic rock with the precision of a modern machinist. Göbekli Tepe sits on a windswept hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and it should not be there at all. Dated to approximately 9600 BCE, it predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years, predates the invention of agriculture, the domestication of wheat, the rise of settled civilization, and yet it stands, a complex of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and symbols and geometric patterns that suggest a sophistication of thought, a mastery of symbolic language that we have no framework to explain. Who built this? Hunter-gatherers, we are told, nomadic peoples who should have been focused on survival, on the next meal, on the harsh realities of an Ice Age world, and yet they quarried limestone, transported pillars, carved cosmologies into stone, and then, most mysteriously of all, they buried it, deliberately, carefully, filling the site with debris as if to preserve it, to hide it, to encode a message for a future that would one day uncover it and ask the question that has no comfortable answer. What civilization existed before civilization? What knowledge was possessed before history began? And what cataclysm erased it so thoroughly that only these fragments remain? The engineering paradox is not merely about weight or distance or the absence of modern tools. It is about the precision, the tolerances, the mathematical sophistication embedded in structures that supposedly predate mathematics. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes the value of pi in its dimensions. The ratio of its height to the perimeter of its base approximates pi to several decimal places, a constant that was not supposedly discovered until the Greeks, millennia later. The same pyramid aligns to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree, a precision that requires not only advanced surveying techniques, but an understanding of the Earth's axial tilt, its rotation, its place in the cosmos. The Temple of the Sun at Teotihuacan in Mexico, the temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the stone circles of Nabta Playa in Egypt, all oriented to celestial events, all encoding astronomical knowledge, all suggesting that the builders possessed not merely skill but science, not merely tradition, but a systematic understanding of the heavens that rivals our own. How were these stones moved? The question has haunted archaeologists for centuries, and the answers provided: ramps, rollers, ropes, sheer human labour multiplied by time, strain credulity when confronted with the actual physics involved. To move an 800-ton block up a ramp requires a ramp of such length and solidity that it would itself constitute an engineering marvel exceeding the original structure. To drag such mass across sand or dirt would require friction coefficients that make the task nearly impossible without the stone sinking into the earth. To lift it into place without cranes or hydraulics defies the mechanical advantage available to ropes and levers alone, and yet the stones are there, undeniably present. Their very existence a rebuke to the limitations we assume governed ancient capabilities. Unless, and here the speculation turns toward the heretical, the mythic, the possibilities encoded in texts we have dismissed as fantasy, unless the method was not mechanical but acoustic, not force but frequency, not labour but resonance. Ancient texts, particularly those attributed to the Watchers, and the knowledge they imparted, speak of sound as a tool, a force capable of moving matter, of altering the fundamental properties of stone and mass. The Book of Enoch describes the angels teaching humanity the secrets of the earth, the heavens, and the manipulation of natural forces through knowledge that was forbidden, precisely because it granted power over the material world. Tibetan monks speak of levitating stones through the focused use of drums and horns, their vibrations creating nodes of pressure that counteract gravity. Modern experiments with acoustic levitation, using sound waves to suspend small objects in midair, demonstrate that frequency can indeed manipulate mass, that the right resonance can create standing waves capable of bearing weight, of moving objects without physical contact. Could the ancients have possessed a more advanced understanding of this principle, a science of sound that allowed them to move stones not through brute force, but through harmonic manipulation, through the precise calibration of frequencies that turned solid matter into something temporarily malleable, responsive, weightless? The possibility feels like science fiction, and yet the global distribution of giant myth suggests a shared memory of beings who possessed exactly this kind of knowledge, beings of immense size and power, who built the foundations of the world and then vanished, leaving only their monuments and the stories that cling to them like morning fog. The Titans of Greece, who held up the sky and moved mountains, who were imprisoned beneath the earth after their rebellion against the Olympians, their strength so great that it took divine intervention to subdue them. The Anakim of Canaan, the sons of Anak, described in the Hebrew Bible as giants who made the Israelite spies feel like grasshoppers, their cities fortified, their lineage traced back to the Nephilim who survived the flood. The Rephaim of Moab, whose name means the shades, or the dead ones, a race of giants whose remnants included Og, the king of Bashan, whose bed was 9 cubits long, 13.5 feet, a scale that suggests either mythic exaggeration or a biological reality we have systematically erased from the acceptable narrative. Cross the ocean, and the myths persist with eerie consistency. The Quinametzin of Mesoamerica, the giants who built the pyramids of Teotihuacan and Cholula, who lived during the previous world ages before the gods destroyed them with floods and fire, their bones supposedly discovered by the Spanish conquistadors and dismissed as the remains of elephants or whales despite being found in landlocked mountain regions. The Tangata Manu of Easter Island, the birdmen who mediated between the human and the divine, whose colossal moai statues, some weighing up to 80 tons, were said to have walked into place, a description that sounds like myth until you consider the engineering experiments demonstrating that the statues could indeed be moved upright, rocked from side to side in a walking motion, by teams coordinating ropes and leverage in ways that suggest the ancient Rapa Nui possessed knowledge of physics and balance that we are only now beginning to reconstruct. The Jotun of Norse sagas, the frost giants and mountain giants who built the walls of Asgard, who represented the primal forces of chaos and nature, who were so integral to the cosmic order that the gods themselves could not exist without them, their eventual destruction at Ragnarok marking not a victory but the end of all things, the collapse of the world into the sea, and the fire that consumes even memory. What unites these myths is not merely the presence of giants but the association of giants with building, with the foundational structures of civilization, with knowledge and power that preceded human history, and then was lost, violently, catastrophically, leaving only ruins and the stories that attempt to explain them. And if the myths are merely myths, why do the ruins persist? Why do we find, scattered across every continent, megalithic structures that exceed our current engineering capabilities, that encode knowledge we supposedly did not possess, that align with celestial events and mathematical constants in ways that suggest a unified, global understanding of the cosmos? Descend beneath the waves, and the enigma deepens into something approaching the apocalyptic. The Gulf of Kumbat, off the western coast of India, conceals ruins that sonar and underwater surveys suggest are geometric, structured, deliberately constructed, streets and buildings and walls resting beneath 100 feet of water, their age estimated by some researchers to be 9,000 years or older, predating the accepted timeline of Indian civilization by millennia, their submersion coinciding with the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically, swallowing coastlines and the cities that once thrived upon them. The Onaguni Monument near Japan, a massive stone structure with terraces, steps and right-angle cuts, lies beneath the Pacific, its origin disputed. Some geologists argue it is a natural formation, sculpted by erosion and tectonic activity, but others point to the tool marks, the post holes, the evidence of deliberate shaping that suggests human hands, or hands like human hands, worked this stone before the sea claimed it, before the deluge that global flood myths describe with such persistent, haunting consistency. And then there is Antarctica, the frozen continent, the landmass buried beneath miles of ice, and yet satellite anomalies, ground-penetrating radar, and the occasional geological survey hint at something beneath, geometric structures, linear formations, anomalies that suggest not merely mountains and valleys, but architecture, constructions that predate the ice, that exist from a time when Antarctica was not the lifeless waste it is today, but a temperate land, a possibility that aligns with the Piri-Reis map of 1513, which depicts the coastline of Antarctica as it would appear without ice. A map supposedly based on older sources that should not exist because Antarctica was not discovered until 1820, and yet there it is, drawn with inexplicable accuracy, as if someone long ago had mapped the world before the ice came, before the cataclysm, before the reset. These underwater and polar remnants suggest a civilization dispersed by catastrophe, a pre-flood world that thrived on coastlines now submerged, in regions now frozen, a world whose extent and sophistication we can only glimpse through fragments, through anomalies, through the ruins that the deluge was too sudden or too incomplete to fully erase. If Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried to preserve it, might other sites have been intentionally placed in locations that would survive, that would endure beneath water or ice, waiting for a future humanity to develop the technology to find them, to decode them, to receive the message encoded in their very existence? The symbolic architecture of the ancient world speaks to this possibility, that these structures are not merely functional but communicative, not merely buildings but archives, messages cast into the future in the only medium guaranteed to outlast flesh and papyrus and memory, stone. The pyramids of Giza align to Orion's belt with such precision that the correlation cannot be accidental. The three pyramids mirror the three stars, their relative sizes and positions matching the celestial pattern, as if the builders were saying, "Look here, look to the heavens, understand that we knew, that we saw, that we mapped the cosmos and embedded it in our monuments, so that you, whoever you are, whenever you find this, will know that we were here, that we understood." The temples of Karnak and Luxor in Egypt, oriented to the winter solstice, their inner sanctums designed so that sunlight penetrates to the deepest chamber, only on that one day, the shortest day, the turning point when the light begins to return, a calendar in stone, a record of astronomical observation, a demonstration of knowledge that required centuries of patient watching, of recording, of understanding the cycles that govern earth and sky. The encoding of mathematical constants, pi, phi, the golden ratio, even the speed of light when certain pyramid dimensions are measured in specific units, suggests that the builders possessed not merely observational knowledge but theoretical understanding, that they knew the relationships governing matter and energy, space and time, and chose to embed these constants in their monuments as a signature, a proof, a challenge to future generations to recognize that the ancients were not primitive, not superstitious, Not merely lucky, but sophisticated, intentional, possessed of a science that we're only now rediscovering through entirely different methods. If you can decode this, the monuments seem to say, if you can recognize the mathematics embedded in our dimensions, then you are ready to understand what we were, what we knew, what we lost. Memory in stone. This is the concept that transforms these structures from archaeological curiosities into something far more profound and unsettling. These monuments are not tombs, not temples in the conventional sense, not merely expressions of religious fervour or political power. They are archives, databanks, messages encoded in the most durable medium available to a civilization that knew it was ending, that understood the flood was coming, that chose to preserve what it could in the only form that might survive. Massive, precisely aligned, mathematically sophisticated stone structures that would outlast the deluge, that would remain when the waters receded, that would speak to the survivors and their descendants in a language of geometry and astronomy and alignment, saying, "We were here, we knew, we built this so that you would remember, so that the knowledge would not be entirely lost, so that when you are ready, you can begin to reconstruct what was taken from you." The stones remember what the flesh forgot. If these traces are real, and the physical evidence suggests they are undeniably provably present, then the haunting question becomes not what survived, but what was erased. If Baalbek and Puma Punku and Göbekli Tepe are the fragments, the remnants, the pieces too massive or too deeply buried to be fully destroyed by the cataclysm, then what else existed? What cities, what libraries, what technologies, what forms of knowledge were wiped clean by the deluge, leaving no trace except the myths, the stories, the persistent global memory of a world that was greater, older, more advanced than the one that came after? The flood, in every tradition that describes it, is not merely a weather event but a reset, an erasure, a divine or cosmic intervention to wipe the slate clean, to remove from the earth a civilization that had reached too far, that had mingled what should not be mingled, that had crossed boundaries of knowledge and biology and power that threatened the very order of creation. And yet the stones remain, the monuments endure, the alignments persist, the mathematics encoded in their dimensions waits patiently for us to develop the tools, the understanding, the willingness to ask the uncomfortable questions. Who built this? What did they know? Why were they erased? And are we, in our drive to decode genomes and split atoms and reach beyond the atmosphere, walking the same path, approaching the same threshold, repeating a cycle that has played out before in an age when the earth was young and the heavens were close, and beings of immense power taught humanity the secrets that would lead to its own destruction? The stones remember what the flesh forgot. They stand as witnesses to a world we can no longer inhabit, to knowledge we can barely reconstruct, to beings whose scale and power we memorialize in myth because the alternative, that they were real, that they built these monuments, that they possessed science and strength beyond our current capabilities, is too disruptive to the narrative of progress we have constructed. The story that tells us we are the pinnacle, the most advanced, the inheritors of an ever-ascending arc of human achievement. But what if the arc is not ascending but cyclical? What if we are not the first to reach for the stars but merely the latest, the most recent iteration of a pattern that has played out before, that will play out again, that leaves behind only stones and stories and the question that will not die? You wouldn't last a day in the Nephilim's world, but their world, encoded in monuments too massive to move and too precise to dismiss, lasts in the bedrock of our planet, waiting for us to remember. The stones remember what the flesh forgot. Part 4. The Flood, the Reset, and the Echoes that Persist. The world of the Nephilim did not end because it was conquered. It ended because it could not be allowed to continue, because the boundary between heaven and earth had grown so thin that it threatened to dissolve entirely, and because the appetites of the giants had become insatiable, consuming not merely the flesh of animals and the fruit of the earth, but the very fabric of reality itself. The flood was not punishment. It was mercy. A divine reset enacted not out of wrath but out of necessity. A surgical erasure of a world that had become unsustainable, where knowledge had outpaced wisdom and power had eclipsed restraint. Imagine a world where the Nephilim's hunger could not be satisfied, where their violence had reached such intensity that the ground itself cried out, where the teachings of the Watchers had given humanity access to forces it could not control, forces that bent matter, altered perception, and threatened to collapse the distinction between the mortal and the eternal. The flood was the only language left, the only act that could speak louder than the roar of the giants, and so the waters came. The mechanics of the deluge are described in Genesis with a precision that suggests not metaphor but memory. The fountains of the great deep broke open, and the windows of heaven were thrown wide. Consider what this means. Not merely rain, but a rupture of the firmament itself, a collapse of the vapour canopy that had insulated the pre-flood world and maintained its atmospheric density, its extended seasons, its strange and luminous light. The fountains of the deep suggest subterranean reservoirs under immense pressure, chambers of water held beneath the crust of the earth, released in a catastrophic hydraulic event that would have sent tsunamis racing across continents, reshaping coastlines, burying cities, and compressing entire civilizations into layers of sediment and stone. The opening of the windows of heaven suggests the collapse of the canopy, a deluge from above that combined with the eruption from below to create a flood of such magnitude that it reshaped the topography of the planet, carved canyons, deposited fossils in impossible strata, and left the memory of the pre-flood world compressed into myth, into fragments, into stories that would be told around fires for millennia but never fully believed. This was not a gentle rain that lasted 40 days. It was a cataclysm that tore the world apart and reassembled it into something smaller, harsher, more fragile. The flood did not merely drown the Nephilim, it drowned the conditions that allowed them to exist. It collapsed the atmosphere, altered the magnetic field, shifted the axial tilt of the Earth, and recalibrated the environment from one optimized for gigantism and longevity to one calibrated for scarcity, for survival, for diminishment. After the flood, the world shrank. Human lifespans, which had stretched across centuries, began to contract. Noah lived 950 years, but his descendants lived progressively shorter spans, as though the biological clock itself had been reset, as though the cellular mechanisms that had once allowed for extended youth and delayed senescence had been shut down by the environmental shift. The stature of humanity diminished as well. The giants who had walked the earth before the flood were not replicated in the same scale afterward, and even the remnants who survived, Og, Goliath, the Anakim, were described as degenerations, as echoes of a grander form, as genetic afterimages fading into extinction. The flood was a shrinking, a compression, a reduction of the world from a state of abundance and terror to a state of scarcity and humility. The air thinned, the light changed, the gravity pressed differently on bones that had once grown tall and strong under a denser atmosphere, and the flora and fauna that had towered over the landscape dwindled into forms that could survive in a harsher, more volatile climate. The world after the flood was no longer optimized for giants, it was optimized for survivors, for creatures small enough to endure, adaptable enough to rebuild, and forgetful enough to move forward without the full weight of what had been lost. But not everything was lost, not entirely. The Nephilim, those hybrid beings born of the union between the Watchers and the daughters of men, were not completely erased by the flood. Genesis speaks of giants in the land after the deluge. Og, the king of Bashan, whose bed was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, a bed of iron that suggests a body too massive for ordinary materials to support. Goliath of Gath, who stood 6 cubits and a span, whose armour weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze, and whose spear was like a weaver's beam. The Anakim, the sons of Enoch, who so terrified the Israelite spies that they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, names that echo across the Old Testament like a litany of the nearly forgotten, a catalogue of remnants. These were not the Nephilim of the pre-flood world, not the giants of 300 cubits who could stride across mountains and whose voices could shatter stone. These were fragments, degenerations, genetic echoes of a race that had been almost entirely wiped out, survivors who carried the bloodline but not the full expression of it, whose size and strength marked them as other, but whose vulnerability marked them as mortal, and they were hunted. The Israelites, under divine mandate, were commanded to exterminate these remnants, to complete the erasure that the flood had begun. The conquest of Canaan was not merely a territorial expansion, it was a campaign of genetic eradication, a systematic removal of the last traces of the Nephilim from the earth. Og was slain, Goliath was felled by a stone, and the Anakim were driven from the land or destroyed utterly. The flood had reset the world, but it had not fully cleansed it, and so the work of erasure continued through sword and fire, through war and conquest, through a divine insistence that the hybrid bloodline must not persist, that the boundary between heaven and earth must be restored and maintained, that the memory of the giants must be compressed into symbol and warning rather than lived reality. But erasure is never total. Memory persists, and so does the question. What if the flood was not merely physical but perceptual, not merely a reshaping of the earth, but a reshaping of consciousness itself? The flood severed humanity's direct access to the divine. The age of the patriarchs, who walked with God and spoke with angels, gave way to an age of distance, of mediation, of prophets and priests who served as intermediaries because the direct line had been cut. The fragmentation of language at Babel, another act of divine intervention, another reset, ensured that humanity would no longer speak a single tongue, that the unity of purpose that had allowed the construction of towers to reach the heavens would be shattered into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 competing narratives, 1,000 ways of forgetting. The memory of the Nephilim survived, but it survived as symbol, as myth, as archetype. The giant, the monster, the forbidden union, the fall from grace. It survived not as lived experience but as story, as warning, as a shadow cast across the collective unconscious of every culture that followed. And yet here we are, building towers again. Look at the skyline of any modern city and you will see it. The impulse to ascend, to reach beyond the horizontal plane of existence and pierce the vertical, to construct monuments that defy gravity and touch the sky. The Tower of Babel was not an anomaly. It was a template, a pattern that humanity returns to again and again, as though the drive to reach the heavens is encoded in our very being. We build skyscrapers, space elevators, rockets that carry us beyond the atmosphere, satellites that orbit the Earth and peer into the cosmos. We decode the genome, manipulating the genetic code with a precision that the watchers might have envied, splicing genes, editing embryos, experimenting with the boundaries of life itself. We manipulate matter at the quantum level, bending particles into superposition, entangling them across distances that defy classical physics, reaching toward a mastery of reality that echoes the forbidden knowledge taught by the fallen angels. We are doing it again. The same impulse, the same threshold, the same choice between restraint and transgression. Is this progress, or is it recurrence? Are we innovating, or are we remembering? The genetic mystery deepens when we consider the possibility that we carry traces of the Nephilim within us, not as myth, not as metaphor, but as literal inheritance, as sequences of DNA that have been passed down through generations, suppressed by the environmental shift that followed the flood but still present, still dormant, still waiting. Modern genomic research has uncovered so-called ghost populations, lineages that interbred with Homo sapiens but whose origins remain unidentified, whose genetic signatures appear in our DNA but do not match any known hominid species. Could these be the remnants of the Nephilim, the genetic echoes of a hybrid race that once walked the earth? Are there dormant genes within us that once allowed for greater size, longer life, altered perception, genes that were expressed in the pre-flood world but have been shut down by epigenetic mechanisms responding to the harsher post-flood environment? If the atmosphere were to change again, if the pressure were to increase, if the conditions of the antediluvian world were somehow restored, would these genes reactivate? Would humanity begin to grow again, to live longer, to perceive differently? The question is not merely speculative, it is genetic, epigenetic, environmental. It is a question of latency, of potential, of what might be unlocked if the threshold were crossed again. But here is the paradox. If the Nephilim were erased, if their bloodline was hunted to extinction, if the flood was designed to reset the world and sever the connection between heaven and earth, why do their symbols persist? Why do we build monuments to reach the heavens? Why do we seek forbidden knowledge? Why do we feel the pull of something older and larger than ourselves? Why does every culture on earth have a memory of giants, of a golden age, of a time when the gods walked among men and the world was different, grander, more terrible? Why do we look at the ruins of Baalbek and feel a sense of recognition, as though we have seen them before in dreams, as though they are not foreign but familiar, as though they are calling us back to something we have forgotten but cannot quite release. The esoteric traditions offer one answer. The flood did not destroy the Nephilim's knowledge, it buried it. The teachings of the Watchers, the secrets of resonance and matter manipulation, the understanding of astronomy and geometry and the hidden structure of reality were encoded into mystery schools, secret societies, and the hidden architecture of temples, cathedrals, and power centres. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the alchemists and hermeticists all claimed to be custodians of ancient wisdom, of knowledge that predated the known civilizations, of a gnosis that had been passed down through initiatory lineages and concealed from the uninitiated. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe, with their precise astronomical alignments and their encoded mathematical ratios, are said to be repositories of this knowledge, structures built according to principles that transcend their ostensible religious function and point toward a deeper, older science. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Parthenon, the temples of Angkor Wat, all encode constants and ratios that suggest a shared source, a common well of knowledge from which diverse cultures drew, a pre-flood archive that survived the deluge in fragments and was reconstructed by those who knew how to read the language of stone and star. If this is true, then the erasure was not complete. The flood changed the chapter, but it did not end the story. And so we return to the question that haunts this entire narrative. Are we living in the aftermath of the Nephilim's world, or are we building toward its return? Is history linear, a progression from ignorance to enlightenment, from myth to science, from darkness to light? Or is history cyclical, a spiral that returns again and again to the same threshold, the same choice, the same forbidden union of earth and heaven? Are we the survivors of a world that ended in cataclysm, or are we the architects of a world that will end the same way, because we cannot resist the impulse to reach beyond our limits, to transgress the boundaries, to seek the knowledge that was forbidden for a reason? The flood did not end the story. It only changed the chapter. The Nephilim are not gone. They are dormant, encoded in myth and stone, and perhaps in the hidden recesses of our own biology, waiting for the conditions that will allow them to return, or for humanity to reach the threshold again and make the same choice that the Watchers made, to cross the boundary between heaven and earth and risk the same annihilation. Every tower we build, every gene we edit, every particle we manipulate, every secret we uncover brings us closer to that threshold. And the question is not whether we will reach it, but whether we will recognize it when we do, whether we will have the wisdom to turn back or the hubris to cross over, whether we will remember the flood or repeat the conditions that made it necessary. The flood did not end the story. It only changed the chapter. And the next chapter is being written now, in laboratories and launch pads and server farms, in the quiet hum of machines that decode the genome and the roar of rockets that pierce the sky, in the restless drive of a species that cannot forget the giants, that cannot release the memory of a world where the heavens were close and the earth was young and the boundary between the mortal and the eternal was thin enough to cross. You wouldn't last a day in the Nephilim's world. But perhaps the Nephilim's world is returning, one gene, one tower, one threshold at a time. And perhaps we are not the survivors of their erasure, but the instruments of their return, carrying the memory forward not because we choose to, but because we cannot help it, because the impulse is encoded in us, because the story is not over, because the flood did not end it, it only changed the chapter. Conclusion and reflection, the memory that will not die. So we return, as all circles must close, to the question that opened this threshold. You wouldn't last a day in the Nephilim's world. Not because you are weak. Weakness is a moral category, and this is a matter of calibration, of compatibility, of the fundamental mismatch between what you are and what that world demanded. Your lungs, evolved for thinner air and gentler pressures, would labour and fail in an atmosphere dense as deep water. Your heart, tuned to the rhythms of a post-diluvian sun, would struggle against the pull of a gravity subtly but catastrophically different. Your eyes, calibrated to process the narrow spectrum of light that filters through our diminished sky, would fracture under the weight of colours that exist beyond the edges of your perception. You are built for a world after the fall, a reality that has been scaled down, thinned out, made survivable precisely because it is no longer what it was. The Nephilim's world was not conquered by time or erosion or the slow march of geological process. It was erased, deliberately and catastrophically, because it could not be allowed to continue, and you, standing here in the aftermath, are the proof of that necessity, the living evidence that survival required diminishment. But the erasure was not complete, was it? The Nephilim are not gone. Not truly, not entirely. They are dormant, folded into the layers of myth and symbol, encoded in the megaliths that refuse to crumble, embedded perhaps in the silent corners of our own biology, where ghost populations whisper through ancient DNA and traits that should not exist linger in the margins of human variance. Every tower we build is an echo of Babel. Every boundary we transgress a repetition of the Watcher's descent. Every secret we uncover a fragment of the forbidden knowledge they taught in the days before the flood. We reach toward the heavens with our satellites and space elevators. We splice genomes and manipulate matter at the quantum level. We build monuments to our own ambition and call it progress, never quite acknowledging that this impulse, this restless, relentless drive to ascend, is not entirely our own. It is the inheritance of a world that touched the stars and paid for it with annihilation, and we are the children of survivors who carry the memory in our bones, in our myths, in the architecture of our dreams. The cycle turns, the spiral returns to the same threshold, and the question is whether we recognize the pattern before we cross it again. There is a melancholy in this recognition, a sorrow that settles like sediment in the deep places of consciousness. We are the survivors of a world we can no longer fully remember, the descendants of those who lived through the flood and forgot, or were forced to forget, what came before. The trauma of the deluge is not recorded in our history books. It is encoded in our collective unconscious, in the universal flood, myths that span every continent and culture, in the persistent sense that we are living in the ruins of something greater, that the earth itself is a palimpsest written over and over until the original text is almost illegible. Our restlessness is not mere ambition or curiosity. It is the ghost of a lost grandeur, the phantom limb of a world where humans walked alongside beings who were more than human, where knowledge flowed directly from the heavens, where the boundary between divine and terrestrial was permeable, negotiable, and ultimately transgressed. We build and destroy, reach and fall, aspire and collapse. And in the repetition there is a pattern that suggests we are not creating something new but remembering something old, trying to reconstruct from fragments a wholeness we can feel but never quite grasp. And yet, and this is where the narrative spirals into stranger territory, some esoteric traditions suggest the Nephilim will return, not as metaphor, not as symbolic representation of human hubris, but as literal restoration of the pre-flood conditions, a cyclical resurgence of the world that was. The atmosphere will thicken again, the vapor canopy will reform, the genetic locks that were sealed by the flood will reopen, and humanity will once more stand at the threshold between ascent and annihilation, faced with the same choice that confronted our ancestors, to remain within the boundaries set by the divine order, or to reach beyond them and risk the consequences. The prophecies are vague, the timelines uncertain, the sources fragmentary and disputed, but the theme recurs across Enochian texts, Gnostic fragments, and the whispered traditions of mystery schools that claim unbroken lineage from the pre-Diluvian age. They speak of a time when the giants will walk again, when the knowledge buried in stone and encoded in symbol will resurface, when the boundaries between worlds will thin, and the sons of God will once more look upon the daughters of men and find them desirable. Whether this is literal prophecy or archetypal warning, the image persists. The Nephilim's world is not dead but sleeping, and the conditions for its awakening are being assembled piece by piece in the technologies and transgressions of the modern age. So the question turns back to you, the listener drifting now between waking and sleep, between the world you know and the world you are imagining. If you could step through the threshold into the Nephilim's world, would you? Not as a thought experiment, not as an abstract speculation, but as a genuine possibility. If the door stood before you, if the air on the other side was thick and luminous and heavy with the scent of flora that no longer exists, if you could see the giants moving in the distance and the sky burning with colours that have no names, would you cross? Knowing that your body would fail within hours, that your lungs would fill and your heart would seize, that your mind would fracture under the weight of perceptions it was never designed to process, would you still want to see it? Would you trade the safety of your diminished reality for one moment of standing in the shadow of beings who walked between heaven and earth, for one breath of air that remembers what it was like when the world was young and the heavens were close, for one glimpse of the architecture and knowledge and terrible beauty that could not be allowed to survive? The question is not rhetorical. It cuts to the heart of what it means to be human in the aftermath, to live with the memory of something greater and the knowledge that you are the price of its erasure. Let the question linger as you drift towards sleep. Let the images settle in the spaces between thoughts, the dense air pressing against your skin, the towering trees whose canopies pierce the clouds, the stones that remember what the flesh forgot, the beings who moved with the weight and grace of a different order of creation. Let yourself imagine the world before the flood, not as paradise but as intensity, as a reality so saturated with presence and power that survival required a kind of strength we no longer possess. You wouldn't last a day in that world. Your body is calibrated for scarcity, your mind for fragmentation, your perception for a reality that has been carefully, mercifully scaled down to something you can endure. But perhaps in dreams you can visit. Perhaps that is the function of myth and symbol and the stories we tell in the dark, to carry us across thresholds we cannot physically cross, to let us stand for a moment in the presence of what was and what might return. Perhaps that is why the memory will not die, why it resurfaces in every culture and every age, why the giants persist in our architecture and our nightmares, and our restless drive to build towers that reach toward the heavens. The flood erased the world, but it could not erase the longing, the sense that we are living in an echo chamber, that the original sound was louder and deeper and more terrible than anything we can now produce. You wouldn't last a day in the Nephilim's world. But the Nephilim's world lasts in you. It lasts in the monuments you build without fully understanding why, in the myths you repeat without remembering their origin, in the genetic traces that whisper through your DNA like rumours of a forgotten lineage. It lasts in your restlessness, your ambition, your refusal to accept the boundaries of the world as it is, and your compulsion to reach beyond them. It lasts in the dreams that visit you in the deep hours of the night, when the barriers between conscious and unconscious thin, and you remember, or imagine you remember, what it was like to walk in a world where the earth was young and the sky was close, and the beings who moved through it were more than human. The memory will not die because it is not merely memory. It is inheritance, imprint, the shadow cast by a light so bright it burned itself into the structure of what came after. So let the story work on you as you sleep. Let it settle into the layers of consciousness where myth and history and dream interweave. Let yourself wonder, in the quiet spaces, whether the cycle is turning again, whether the threshold is opening, whether the choice that faced the ancients will soon be yours. And when you wake, if you choose to explore further, to share your thoughts, to sit with the mystery and let it unfold in its own time, know that you are not merely consuming a story, but participating in a transmission, carrying forward a memory that has survived flood and fire and the deliberate erasure of worlds. The Nephilim's world is gone, but it is not finished, and neither perhaps are you.